Hello and welcome to the Sheldrake-Vernon Dialogues with myself, Mark Vernon, and Rupert Sheldrake. Hi, Rupert.
Hello, Mark.
We get together and, prompted by something we've been thinking about, encountering, reading, have a conversation that we hope will elicit your own thoughts, further conversations even, as we reach out into various parts of understanding the world that we're interested in. And today, our conversation has been prompted by both reading a book by a chap called David Bentley Hart, who incidentally is a very interesting philosopher and thinker, particularly in areas like consciousness. But in a way, it's the setup of his new book that has prompted our thoughts. It's called Roland in Moonlight. And much of the book is framed by his conversations with his dog called Roland. And so that made us think about animals and speaking animals and mythological animals and how they often, it seems, in mainstream religious traditions, like, for example, the Bible, there's strange characters like Balaam's ass that turns out to be speaking as an angel, but also in folk traditions as well, and of course, shamanic traditions as well, where animals take us to a kind of liminal zone and where the world, you might say, re-enchants and all sorts of voices and other encounters become possible. So this area of animals and the enchanted world, perhaps, or other voices, other dimensions of reality, I thought might be a kick-off point for us today, Rupert. Now, I guess this makes some sense to you as well.
Well, yes, I think talking animals is obviously a very deeply archetypal theme. You have it in Aesop's fables and in the West. And then, of course, children's stories are absolutely full of talking animals. My favourite talking animal when I was a child was Rupert Bear, for obvious reasons. But you know, there's Peter Rabbit, and you know the Beatrix Potter books, and there's Squirrel Nutkin. I mean, there's endless books which have talking animals, and Dr. Dolittle for somewhat older children. You know, who knows what all animals are saying, who has the gift of understanding animals. This is a very standard thing in children's literature, and as you say, it has echoes in shamanic traditions. In the Hindu tradition, one of the gifts, one of the siddhis of advanced yogis is understanding the cries of all creatures, you know, understanding animal languages and what they're saying. So it seems to be an extraordinarily deep archetype in humanity, and probably because shamanic cultures are hunter-gatherer societies, the gathering side of it is, you know, you have to know about plants, but the hunting side you have to know about animals, and you have to know where they are and what their habits are, and you have to come to some kind of agreement with the animals so that, you know, they're not too upset by being killed. So it involves a kind of symbiosis or interplay with the animal and plant realms, and shamans seem to be the figures who are the intermediaries between the human and the non-human realms. So in children's stories we have a reflection of that. I mean, obviously characters like Rupert Bear are very humanoid. I mean, he's like a little boy who has wonderful adventures. But it's interesting that in our materialistic, mechanistic, secular, disenchanted official world, even parents who are hardcore materialists and atheists still seem quite happy to have their children read stories about talking animals, entering an animistic world from which they're rudely awoken around the age of 10 or 11 when they're told tooth fairies don't exist and that kind of thing, and Santa Claus doesn't really exist. And then if it's Richard Dawkins who's making this argument, then God doesn't exist either. He's no more than a kind of tooth fairy fantasy of young children. That's the kind of world we've set up. But what's so interesting about David Bentley Hart, who's a very sophisticated philosopher of mind, I mean, he's, you know, definitely one of the figures one would sit next to at the kind of high table of a consciousness conference. And he's a fascinating figure in many ways because of his command of not only Eastern philosophy, but also Western philosophy, the deeper aspects of theology. Um, he's very well up on contemporary science and what's going on in contemporary science. And he's chosen in this his one of his more adventurous intellectual books to put extraordinary discourses in the mouth of his dog Roland. And Roland turns out to be extremely up to speed on Western philosophy. He's read the latest philosophers. Um, he can come out with astonishing thoughts about the nature of God and consciousness in the natural world and so on. And in a sense, he's putting forward in the dog's mouth ideas that probably in his own mind are the most speculative ideas he's thinking about. And he, in these dialogues with the dog, takes the role of being somewhat sort of pedestrian and academic and limited, whereas the dog has this voice of speculative, philosophical exploration. It's a very extraordinary thing he's done there, and I personally found it very engaging. I haven't quite finished the book yet, but I found it very engaging because somehow the fact that, or at least the fiction, that a dog is saying these things somehow suspends disbelief, and it's possible to explore these speculative journeys much more than one might otherwise do.
Yeah, I think that's part of the enchantment of the book, that it takes you into a more enchanted realm that is a place where more than you normally take to be the case can be contemplated and received. You can sort of participate in a wider world through having you might, in a Jungian way, you might say the kind of active imagination of having a conversation with a creature that you have a lot of feeling for, a lot of affection for, that in the case of his pet dog feels like it came into his life at a moment where in one way his life was breaking down. He's quite clear about this in the book. He was quite ill. His academic life was unsatisfying. He was living in a place that he didn't particularly like. And so he was having a sort of, I mean, he doesn't quite put it like this, but a sort of breakdown, but the kind of breakdown where breakthroughs can occur. And the dog, I think it's called Roland in Moonlight, because the other facet is the kind of altered state that he's always in slightly in these exchanges with the dog, which is at the beginning and end of the day in this kind of liminal space under a lunar light, you might say, rather than the brightness of a solar glare. And so all this takes him to a place where he can receive more. I mean, I wondered as well whether it's well timed, because it feels like we live in a moment where we're becoming more and more conscious of the intelligence that other creatures have around us once again. I was just hearing particularly about the intelligence of, well, the way that intelligence connects to our senses. And the idea was to use Blake's remark that our senses kind of enclose the world and bring us to kind of tangible contact with the world. But the way that they enclose the world also means that we might become aware of what's more than just what's tangibly enclosed. So again, a sense that our senses contain things is also to become aware to what they might not manage to directly present to us, so we can encounter in other ways. So this was related particularly, say, to dolphins, whose sonar capacities is a form of sight. And so dolphins not only see with their eyes, but they see with their clicks and so on. And so, for example, they live in a world where there isn't such a neat distinction between what's inside and outside. The idea is that when a dolphin approaches another dolphin, it sees what's inside the dolphin as well as what's on the surface of the dolphin. So a male dolphin might see whether a female is pregnant or not. But when you add that to manifest dolphin intelligence as well, and start to wonder what would it be like to live in a world where you might see inside as well as outside, see a kind of the inner vitality of things as much as the surface vitality, that quite quickly takes you to the world of clairvoyance, of other kinds of perception. and so can be used to help us think ourselves into a world where we don't just turn to the empirical senses, but turn to other senses that might convey things to us, which is also to say that animals are kind of good to think with. They do expand our consciousness when we quite tangibly, in the case of the dolphin and thinking about its own senses, try to get a sense of its expanded encounter with the world around us, and then we might learn from that as well. So when I was reading about Roland the dog, and the lunar light, and thinking about how different in a way that is from my everyday assumptions that I have my five senses and it's best to have the lights turned up full to see things. You can see things in different lights, in different states of mind as well, which I guess pets do for people quite often. Just another thought, in therapy, if someone says they have a pet, I work as a psychotherapist, and if someone says they have a pet, it's always good to ask about that, because the pet often, in the dynamic of the family or just in the dynamic of the pet and its owner, picks up aspects of what's going on that maybe just below conscious awareness. And so, if the dog becomes agitated, that's often a sign of something agitated in the house. So the minute you start to think about it, this is a kind of very inviting way of engaging with the world, as well as you're saying, connecting to shamanic ideas and archetypal ideas as well.
Well, interesting you should say that about pets, and that's one of the themes actually in my most recent book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. I have a chapter on learning from animals, and I've done a lot of research on people's relationship with pets, including my own. My book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, is very much about those abilities where animals have sensitivities that seem to go beyond our own. Most dogs are more telepathic with their owners than their owners are with other people. That they pick up their intentions from far away, which is how many dogs and cats know when their owners are coming home, even when they come at random times in unfamiliar vehicles, no familiar sounds, smells, or clues, or routines. So that's one area where our domestic animals are often much more sensitive than us. Another is in their ability to foresee what's going to happen or have premonitions of earthquakes and tsunamis and other disasters. And some people who have epileptic seizures have seizure alert dogs that warn them of oncoming seizures in a way that no medical device can do. So no one knows how they do it. And then they have a sense of direction that enables swallows to migrate from southern Africa to the same place in England where they nested last year and then migrate back again in the autumn. And all these other migratory feats, and homing pigeons who can find their home from more than 600 miles away and get back in a single day. All these are abilities that animals have that far exceed our own. And of course, they also have physical skills that exceed our own. When you watch gibbons jumping from branch to branch in trees, or squirrels, or birds flying, or moles burrowing, all of these animals can do things we can't do, or at least without machinery, like planes and burrowing devices. So I think that there's already a vast range of areas where non-human animals greatly exceed our own abilities, from which we can learn. I think we can learn about psychic abilities from animals because they're better at them than we are, and they're less controversial in the animal realm. And that helps us to realize that these abilities are not paranormal or supernatural. They're natural, they're normal, they're part of our biological nature. And I also think that animals may have spiritual connections. If we see, as Roland in Moonlight does, as the dog does, that as David Bentley Hart has argued more intellectually in some of his other books, that there's a kind of immanence of the divine. The divine consciousness is present in all nature and in all animals and in the whole of the natural world. There is a divine consciousness underlies the consciousness that animals have themselves. And so a sense of spiritual connection between our consciousness and the divine that happens through mystical experiences may not be confined to humans. It may be that dogs, by living in the present, or cats, have a closer access to the spiritual realm, which after all can only be accessed in the present. I mean, a lizard basking in the sun may be in a state of bliss. The assumption that only humans have spiritual experiences and only a few humans have them, and they only have them very rarely, is a kind of scarcity model of spiritual or mystical experience. And it may be that it's abundant throughout the natural world, and that we're unusual in closing out this sense of connection with the greater reality. And so I think it's particularly interesting that in Hart's book, Roland the dog is given some of the most profound reflections on the nature of consciousness within the natural world, and that these are spoken through the mouth, or rather telepathically through the mind of a dog.
Yeah, no, the driving metaphysic or ontology in the book is what in Indian philosophy would be called non-dualism, and I think exists in Christianity as well, particularly in Eastern Christianity, which David Bentley Hart knows about particularly, as well as Indian philosophy. And I say that because I think that helps to make sense of what you're saying, in my mind, that all of our consciousnesses, whether we're human or animal, are in a way echoes or reflections or mirrors of the one divine consciousness. And because of that, they're also maybe lenses and focuses of particular aspects of the one consciousness. Now, I think that you could say that the human consciousness is particularly engaged with metacognition, the kind of reflection upon the nature of consciousness, whereas another animal might participate just very directly and radiantly, therefore, in another aspect of the divine consciousness. And I guess you see this in polytheistic religions as well, where animals very naturally become associated with different aspects of reality. So when you, in ancient Egypt, see the bull, it's not, as it were, that I don't think the Egyptians were worshipping bulls directly, although of course, can be expressed in that way. But what they're being aware of is that the bull manifests a certain aspect of divine reality that you can make contact with through the sacred bull. I think the same thing is a way of understanding astrology, actually, that the celestial bodies, like the moon, in the case of David Bentley Hart's book, it's not that they are separate kind of deities, although sometimes it is talked about in that way, but rather that they manifest certain aspects of the one divinity, and that by contemplating, say, the moon, certain aspects of that consciousness become clearer to us. It might be the changeable nature of things, or shifts that are necessary, stepping into different states of mind and so on, that are particularly associated with the moon, and can even provoke lunacy, therefore, as a result. So I really like that idea, that animals, they're completely embedded in consciousness and life, of course, but participate in other ways, and that we therefore can make something of that by turning to them and developing our relationships with them.
Well, of course, it's very explicit in India, where I lived for years. Sacred cows are the most obvious example. And they're so sacred that even today in modern India, a cow can wander into the middle of a road and the traffic will all go round it. That, seeing them as a manifestation of particular principles, it does seem to be how they're seen. I remember I once went to a fairly small temple in Secunderabad with Jill, now my wife. At the time she wasn't my wife, but she was visiting me in India. And there was a sacred cow munching away on some straw in this temple. And there was a Brahmin priest who was in the temple, and he's explained what was going on. And he said, yes, he said, the cow is the mother. She is the mother. He said, your wife, he assumed Jo was my wife, she said, she is a cow. That is great thing, she is a cow. And now, in England, it wouldn't be taken as a compliment if you say to him, she is a cow. But he intended this as the highest compliment, and luckily Jill took it in her stride. But the equation of the maternal principle and the cow and the looking after the young and the providing of milk seemed to him completely natural. Whereas for us, cows are merely cogs in the production machine of agribusiness, and especially in America, where they're sort of injected with hormones, and the whole thing is to see them as milk production machines. A completely different attitude to animals in traditional societies. I thought another aspect of David Bentley Hart's book was, as well as the dog, there's one of the other presences in the book is his fictitious great uncle Aloysius, who was an early pagan in sort of early 20th century America, who wrote pagan type plays and polytheistic romances and odes about nature and poetry about a girl he was in love with who died. That's the other great presence beside the dog in the book, and indeed the dog turns out in the book to have been doing secret research and compiling an annotated bibliography and biography of the great uncle, the pagan great uncle, and fills in David Bentley Hart with details about his supposed ancestor. I wonder what you made of that, because it would seem to me that through this fictitious great uncle he was exploring a Western, somewhat romantic move towards nature and relating to the natural world, unmediated by the Christian tradition, but going back to a Greek tradition. But the great uncle is portrayed as being sort of somewhat quaint and of course highly eccentric, and not a very good poet. And so in a sense his experiment failed, but it was an attempt to reconnect with the living world in a way that went back to the roots of Western civilization through the Greeks.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about it was another important element. I mean, just as an aside, I was smiling while you were saying that, the dog annotating the great uncle's work. And I think actually levity, humor, fun is a really key part of the book. And I made some sense of that by thinking about the word levity, which now we use to refer to humor. But of course, in the medieval mind, in the earlier minds, it was also that quality of mind that made you rise to the heavens. It was the spiritual rising kind of quality of our consciousness, as opposed to gravity, which was the aspect of our minds that bring us down to earth. And so I think his use of humor is really quite deliberate. And of course, although he can be a very penetrating writer, he can also be a very witty, even acerbic writer, actually. And I think that is very much part of his appeal, to sort of stir up these other perceptions of things. But I took Aloysius to be a figure who strove to participate in an older consciousness, so hence going back and trying to reconnect with pagan ideas and so on. But the failure to do that wholly satisfactorily being a really important thing about our moment now, because we must move forward, I think, not move back. And I get this from, this great inspiration for me, Owen Barfield, one of the Inklings, who's also mentioned in the book, almost in passing, actually. And I think that David Bentley Hart isn't quite sure what to make of Owen Barfield. I think he knows Barfield was onto this sense that our participation in life does evolve, does change, and that ancient participation is different from now. He has one or two sort of slightly technical remarks about Barfield being a bit too Kantian. And I think that is David Bentley Hart's pull to the east. I think Bentley Hart, this is a bit technical, but I think Bentley Hart probably feels that Kant was a bit of a mistake. This idea that you couldn't know the thing in itself in Western thought just set up a whole kind of detour in terms of our participation with the world. It was a bit unnecessary, and the Romantic movement actually found a way through that by saying it's just ridiculous to think that we don't participate in the world around us. We participate with our own inner lives, you might say, very directly. We know ourselves as a thing in itself. So that is already a bridge to knowing the thing in itself through a more romantic imagination. But nonetheless, the main Barfieldian point about how the past is different from the present and how we must move into a new future, I felt that was what was being, in a way, triangulated between the figures of David Bentley Hart himself, who's the kind of transitional figure, Roland the dog, who's already in the sense of what might be possible tomorrow in terms of abiding and participating in the world in a new way, but that's not a return to the past, as great uncle Aloysius had tried to do, because we are invited to do so with more awareness, more consciousness, both the kind of intellect that can articulate these kind of things, as well as the felt sense that can know more intuitively or imaginatively that there's an inside to the whole world, as well as our own inside, as Owen Barfield put it. So there was something about kind of the dialogues between these different figures, and that Aloysius wasn't himself present, but was being remembered, that sort of put him into the past, but that for me carried the book into what might be possible in the future.
Yes, I think that puts it really clearly, Mark. I think because he clearly is seen as a figure in the past himself, and when Roland is annotating his bibliography and so forth, it's for some archival historical society. I mean, it's kind of very much to do with things with the past. He himself was preoccupied with the past. He was writing sort of 17th century type masques and plays and poetry, and so Aloysius was all about the past, and Roland is getting his papers in order and making an annotated bibliography and that sort of thing is, again, a historiographical exercise. It's not about the future and the big picture. So I think in a way he is showing this as part of something we've moved beyond, and this attempt to go back to the past didn't work. And of course, one of the things Aloysius tried to do was short-circuit out the entire Christian tradition by going back to pre-Christian Greek thought. Well, since David Bentley Hart is Eastern Orthodox, I suppose Greek or Russian, maybe Greek Orthodox, then for his understanding of the Greek tradition, it's moved on beyond ancient classical Greek. It's moved on to this whole Orthodox tradition of theology, which is very much more about the immanence of the divine than Western theology. I mean, after all, in Eastern theology, the Holy Spirit is the breath of God, the Spirit of God in all nature, in all things. And so it's much, much more along those lines.
Yeah, I liked at one point where they reflect a bit on panpsychism and how they say it's not just, as it were, soul that fills all things, but that nous, mind, fills all things, and pneuma, spirit, divine, fills all things. And that feels a really important Christian development, which I think you can actually find parallels in Chinese traditions and in Indian traditions as well. Different ways of talking about the logos, as it would be put in the Christian tradition. But it's about, well, actually, there was a nice parallel connection that I made. At the same time, I've been reading a book called The Mystery of Physical Life by Grant Watson, which I'm sure is a book you know.
Yes.
And it's he's a naturalist who knew an enormous amount, particularly about symbiosis in nature and how different organisms work together. And he wonders very profoundly about whether evolution, construed as just random mutations that get selected, is at all enough to account for the extraordinary symbiosis that you see in nature, and so has a sense that there might be a kind of impulse from the top down that's drawing life forth, as much as just kind of arising by random processes. And I'm sure you've thought about this because it has obvious links with your own work. But the particular thing I really liked was that at one point he talks about plants and how plant leaves and the arrangement of seeds and so on can mirror what we would call a Fibonacci series, this mathematical series. But what he says, Grant Watson says, is that what we appreciate sort of with our nous, with our minds, as a mathematical series, the plant is appreciating by its participation with light and with nature. And when you start making those kind of links, it opens up a very rich new perception of what science might be about, which isn't, as it were, about trying to understand things mechanically, to extract, to use and so on in a more technological way. But the science becomes a way that we see how the natural world is participating in this wider intelligence as well. And we speak about it in our own terms, like through mathematical series such as the Fibonacci sequence. But it is our logos element sharing in the divine logos that's articulating what the world around us in plants as well as animals is doing all the time already as well. It's a kind of Goethean science, Grant Watson says, this romantic tradition in science, which has to have a soulful encounter with the natural world as well as a more analytical, empirical encounter. So it took me in that direction as well, towards Grant Watson's book.
Wonderful, Mark. Well, I think that's something we might have to take up on another occasion. But I think this has been very, very helpful for me. I mean, all our dialogues actually I find really helpful, and they go beyond where I could possibly have gone on my own. And this has opened up David Bentley Hart's book and his conversations with Roland for me in a new way. And anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thanks to you who've been listening, because, you know, the book, David Bentley Hart's book, Roland in Moonlight, is a dialogue. It's in dialogue that new things emerge. It's why we, Rupert and myself, have dialogues, and very much hope that it will provoke dialogues either in your own mind or with others as well, because that is the liminal space where, who knows, the moon and even animals might speak to you. So thanks very much, Rupert. Thank you.